In Genesis 2:24, it says that God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Does that mean that God had forgotten his covenant at some point? Find out now on today's episode of Look at the Camera, Not the Screen. This is where the Cinco Stones theme song would come in. I'll get one eventually. Now before we get to that verse, we gotta pick up where we left off in the last video. And in verse 16 and 17, it talks about how the Midianite priest sent his 7 daughters to go get water for the flocks. Now, one thing that's interesting is that's really hard work. And I don't mean that in a condescending way toward women. I'm saying that in our culture, how many times do you necessarily see daughters going out and cutting the lawn? No, you normally send your son to go cut the lawn. And that is my point, is that jobs that are for guys or girls is a cultural thing, and I think our culture would definitely benefit from us trying to take a couple more steps back from those mindsets that, a nurse is a female job or being a plumber is a guy's job. That doesn't have to be that way. And that was something that I kind of noticed here. Those women had to get water, and those things are heavy. They are not light to carry. Some of you guys could use that as a workout. I'm just saying. So what also happens in those 2 verses is shepherds go and chase off the women, and Moses is like, nah, I ain't having that on my watch. And he chases those shepherds off, and then he goes and gets the water for the women, and they take it back to where they live. And in the next verse, you find out that their dad's name is Raul, not just a Midian priest, and that he's like, why'd y'all come back so soon? And then in the next verse, I like how the NLT says it. I'm just gonna straight up read it. An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they answered, and then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. Moses did such a good job that he did it faster than they did. And Raul realized that, and he's like, I need this dude working for me. But really, he does say in the next verse, he's like, why didn't, bring him back, like, let's feed him. Do you girls just wanna be single forever? This dude, like, is strong, he protected you, he works hard. I'll get him a job. He can work for us. Now we're on to the next verse. Crazy amount of stuff happens in this verse. He not only decides to live with them, but then he also gets a wife. 1 verse, that's it. And then the next verse, 22, he has a son, names him Gershom, and then tells us why he named him that. Now, in case you missed it, we just talked about Moses' whole life up to the burning bush in less than 1 chapter. Moses, who wrote 5 books of the Bible. 5 books, and he was in all of them. He summarized 80 years of his life in just 22 verses. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling... Now, an observation that I kind of made was that Moses by himself isn't important. He's only important when it's God's plan that's taking place. The reason that Moses is here so much in scripture is because of God, not because of Moses himself. And so you're able to sum up 80 years of his life in just 22 verses. So we should really see that scripture is not about people necessarily. It is always about God and what God is doing in people's lives. We find our purpose in God. We don't make our own purpose. But that's something that I saw that was kind of subtle. What do you think? And now we're here, the moment you've been waiting for, verses 23 through 25. This actually kind of gets translated slightly different depending on your translation, but they all do point toward the same meaning. This is actually a good place to jump into a parallel translation and see the complexities of language being translated from one language to another. But since this is not a deep dive, this is just kind of a more simple devotional, I'm gonna pick one translation to read this part, and then we'll do a little bit of jumping in. And then I'll answer the question that you came here looking for. I got your answers. During that long period of time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned of slave labor. They cried out, and their desperate cry because of their slave labor went up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God understood. When it says God understood, it might be a little difficult to understand why, but check out how others say it. The ESV says, and God knew. The LEB says, and God took notice. Then you have the NIV that says, and he was concerned about them. And then finally, the NLT says, and he knew it was time to act. But as you can see, with that simple phrase, God understood, there's already complexities coming in. So when we head over to remembered, take that into note. My wife's first language is not English. And sometimes I'll end up using an idiom that she is not aware of and takes my words literally. Now, what do I mean? For instance, when we were married, I said, hey, let's go to bed. And so she went to bed and she had her phone out and she's ready to just hang out. And I'm like, what are you doing? I'm trying to go to sleep. And she said, well, you said, let's go to bed. I'm going to bed. And I was like, I meant like go to sleep. And she's like, then why didn't you say go to sleep? And I'm like, because it's an idiom, I guess. Now, if you're taking her side, here's a better idiom. Don't let the cat out the bag, meaning don't tell the secret. I love idioms. What's one of your go-to idioms so I can use it? So as you're probably connecting the dots, you're realizing that I'm gonna say that remember is an idiomatic term that really meant something else. Well, what did it mean and what proof do you have? All right, here we go. I will link the commentary down below that I got this from. The average Israelite likely knew at least something about the Abrahamic covenant, and it may be useful for the modern reader to realize that the term zākar, remember, is an idiomatic for covenant application rather than recollection. Meaning, in other words, God remembered his covenant is to say God decided to honor the terms of his covenant at this time. Now, there's actually proof that scripture has used this idiom before. I'll give you one and I'll link the rest. Genesis 9:15. And I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. So I will apply my covenant to all living things and to all creatures. We even use remember idiomatically, because if you're to say I will remember that, it doesn't mean like, oh, I'm going to forget and then I'm going to remember on cue. Because if you remember something when you want to, then you never really forgot it in the first place. Or when you say, hey, don't forget me when you get to the top, and they reply, I'll remember you. You're not hoping that they're gonna be like, oh, I remember my friend now that I'm on the top. Thanks. And then move on with their life. Like, you're like, hey, give me that money, son. I helped you out, or whatever you want from them. But we use remember idiomatically too, even today. Which comes to the full conclusion that language and even the human mind can have a very difficult time fully comprehending God. And so we have to be careful not to put God in these boxes of language and of what we can logically understand at times. Guys, there's so much that we can learn from scripture, especially the parts that don't get preached. And that's why I didn't want to skip any of those verses. So I hope this encourages you to maybe pick up a commentary and at the very least, start asking questions as you read. Write down your questions and then look for answers from maybe somebody at your church or send them to me. Those are your only two options. Thank you again for watching this video. Like if you think other people should find this on YouTube. Share if you thought this was good and you just want to put your stamp of approval on it. And subscribe if you think this is something worth listening to, because I'm going to start putting them out every Friday now. Thank you.